name is L1P1. I'm a lecturer. I will give the 6 theoretical lectures that you will have every Monday from now on. There will be one practical lecture where you will have a few exercises and look at some things that were on theoretical slides in more detail. The one practical lecture will be in the 7th week. So after the 6 theoretical lectures in week 7, you will have a practical lecture which will be given by Barbara Sadaba. So the classes will always be on Monday at 1. And for the location, because the location tends to change from week to week, you can always send online. So as I said, we will have theory and applications of the theory, and by applications I mean we will look at research papers to illustrate the theory. So the theory and applications of the theory will be given in weeks 1 to 6, and there will be one practical lecture where you will have a few problems and some applications maybe as well. That will be in week 7. The contents of the course. The course, of course, has to be limited because we don't have that much time. So, as it is an advanced course in macroeconomics, and we want to go into all the topics in much detail, we can only cover a few topics. And the 2 topics that will be dealt with in this course are consumption and saving in the first 3 weeks. So we start with that today. And then business cycle analysis in the weeks 4, 5, and 6. That's the second topic of the course. Of course, macroeconomics is very broad. There are many more topics that we would like to see in more detail, but we're limited because of the number of lectures that are possible for this course. Then the grade. So students tend to think this is a difficult course. So one of the reasons maybe that it's difficult is that the full grade is based on your exam. And the exam will be in the 8th week of the course. What will you be given as an exam? There will be 2 or 3 topical questions. So one question on consumption, definitely, one on business cycles, maybe a second one on consumption or a second one on business cycles. And then every question will have a number of subdivisions, which have to be answered concisely. So to give you an idea of what you can expect, of course, in a few weeks, I will post an example exam on Blackboard. Then you can immediately see the type of exam. The exam that you will be given in week 8 will be very similar to the example exam. So, apart from that, I should also tell you that you are not required to be here. So I will not check your names. So attendance is strictly not required, neither for the theory nor for the one practical lecture. So you don't have to be here, but I would advise you to be here to follow the lectures. So that's most important. What I would also like to tell you is that the lectures are based on a number of lecture slides. This is the first of those lecture slides. So every lecture you will have 40 or 50 lecture slides, between 40 and 50. And that is the main thing that you have to study. But if you understand everything that is written on the lecture slide, you are very well prepared. Of course, you may want to have some more background, or maybe you don't understand something that's in length. But it's always nice to be able to look it up somewhere. And most of the lecture slides are based on the book Advanced Macroeconomics by Warmer, which I think is the 6th edition. It's definitely the last one that you should consult, because it's quite different from the previous one. Is the 4th? Okay. 4th edition of Advanced Macroeconomics is the 2012 edition. Okay, so I always forget the name. much detail. So if you don't understand something about the application, then you can consult the research paper. The research paper that we discussed in details are also posted on Blackboard. So on Blackboard you will find for both parts of the course, you will find a reference list where you have chapters that you need or that you can consult in order, where you also have the main research papers for the application that you look at, and where you have also for those who want a bit more background and who want a simpler explanation of the topics that you look at, there's also a reference to discussion of those topics at a more intermediate level. So, and you can consult a more intermediate group. And then there's a whole lot of other papers that we will not discuss, but on which all these theories are based. They're also given to you for you to have as a means to know where all the theories that we look at come from. But of course, you don't need to study all those papers. You can just check the reference list on Blackboard, and you will see what I'm talking about. Now, the topics of maybe I'll keep it like this for you to have also the blue part of the slides. Now, the topics that we will look at, as I told you, first consumption and saving. And we will start from the very beginning, the standard basic theory of permanent income. We will do that today. And then, at the end of this lecture, we will talk about, we will extend this already, make it a bit more interesting, by looking at uncertainty. We will find that if the permanent income hypothesis holds, that at the aggregate level, aggregate consumption, should follow what we call a random form. So this will be the main topics of today. We will, in due time, understand what we mean by a random form. We end the lecture by an application of this random walk hypothesis, and then next week will be devoted to precautionary savings and liquidity constraints, where we basically leave the framework of the permanent income hypothesis and make things more complicated. And when you make things more complicated, you also make things more realistic. So we will allow for precautionary savings, for liquidity constraints, when can consumers borrow, under what conditions can people get a loan. Precautionary savings is about saving out of precautionary motives. When do people do that? So these are basically deviations from the permanent income hypothesis. This is the topic of next week. And then 2 weeks from now, the last lecture on consumption and savings will deal with some finance. We will look at the main model used in finance, which is interesting for us because it's based on consumption. That's a consumption cap M model, and we will look at a very interesting topic, which is the equity premium cost. And then the final topic of this part of the course will be linking the permanent income hypothesis to government behavior, which brings us to the Ricardian equivalence theorem. Then, now, okay, the second part of the course will be dealing with business cycles. That's basically the hardest part of the course. We will try to figure out why business cycles occur. Given the recent Great Recession and all the problems that both were happening in the US as well as in Europe, it's very interesting to know what the main theories and the main modern theories are regarding the occurrence of business cycles. And hopefully these theories can also help us to understand how policy The standard is the real business cycle theory, which is based on a neoclassical vision of the economy, and which states that basically business cycles are occurring in an environment where prices are fully flexible. That will be the topic of the fourth lecture. We will devote an entire lecture on real business cycle theory. And then afterwards, the fifth and the sixth lecture of the course will be on new Keynesian theory, where we basically will make the assumption that prices and wages are not fully flexible. We will introduce the concept of sticky prices and wages, which will lead to different conclusions with respect to how business cycles occur and how we can fight business cycle fluctuations. So, David Rowe will be the main reference are, of course, the lecture notes, the lecture slides. If you don't, if you want more background, some things are not clear anymore, go to the book by Romer and check out chapter 8, especially for the first part, and chapters 5, 5, and 6 for the second part. Chapter 8 for consumption, and a little bit of 12 for consumption, and then chapters 5 and 6 for the second part for the business cycle part. And all the applications, as I already said, all the applications, all the research papers are put on Blackboard and on the reference list that is now also on Blackboard. Okay, so I think I explained the most important things that I have to tell you before we start. So I would suggest we start now with the part on the consumption and saving. And you may immediately ask me, why would we be interested in consumption and why would we be interested in saving? Well, there are at least 3 good reasons for that. And the first one is that, of course, private consumption, because that's what we're talking about, it's private consumption. We're not going to say much about government consumption. Private consumption is by far the largest component of aggregate demand. So you can expect a potentially large effect of aggregate private consumption on the business side. That's one good reason. Now, another good reason is when we talk about welfare, and what is welfare? Welfare of society, there's a sum of individual utilities of all the people in the society. What does it depend on? It depends on consumption. When people have consumption or are allowed to consume, they derive utility from that, and utility of all the individuals in society make up welfare. And then another reason, which will be less focused on in this course, because in this course, as I told you, we're focusing on business cycles rather than on growth, for instance. But another good reason for studying private consumption is that the counterpart of consumption is saving. When people don't consume, they necessarily must save. So when people save, what happens is that wealth in the economy will increase, and if wealth in the economy increases, that means that the economy has more capital, and capital is a precondition for growth. So society with much capital, physical capital, for instance, is a society that could have more growth. Well, if we are going to study consumption, we want a good theory for that. And a good theory, what should a good theory do? Well, it should be not too complicated, because it has to capture the essence. So a good theory is something that will capture the essence. So if you have a theory that is exactly depicting the real world, it's going to be too complicated, and you're not going to be able to focus on what you want to explain. So theory should be complicated, sufficiently realistic, but not too complicated. Now, one thing that you want your theory to be able to do is that it should be able to explain the data. And one observation that is very we see that consumption is typically not so volatile. It doesn't vary as much as other components do, for instance, investment or government consumption. You have a figure here where you have the same observation for the US and for the Euro area. You have consumption over GDP, you also have investment over GDP, and you have government consumption over GDP. And we are looking at variability. In particular, what we depict here is the coefficient of variation. And what is that? That's basically the standard deviation of C over I divided by the mean of C over I. That's just a measure to find out how volatile something is. It's like the variance, the coefficient of variation is the standard deviation divided by the mean. So you can see that this coefficient of variation, this volatility of C over I, is much smaller than the volatility of the other component of GDP, which in this case we look at investment and government consumption. So a good theory of consumption should be able to explain why this is the case. So we want a model that describes the behavior of consumption, and we are looking, in this course, we are looking at dynamic macroeconomics. The modern approach to macro is dynamic, so we're looking at how variables change over time. We're trying to explain that. So it's not just doing some comparative statics and comparing different situations in a static way. No, we really want theories that explain how consumption, in this case, behaves over time. So a good model should be able to describe the behavior or the allocation of consumption over time. Now, a good model should be able to explain what we observe, and in this case, we observe this low volatility. So a model should be explaining this lower volatility, as well as other facts. We want a good model that explains as much of the data as possible, and not just aggregate data. So we might have a very nice macro theory on consumption that does a good job of explaining the aggregate behavior. What I mean by aggregate is a sum over all households. But it might do a very poor job of explaining how individual consumption at the household level behave. So we wouldn't like that. Ideally, a good consumption theory is consistent with both macro at aggregate level as well as household behavior, micro behavior. Well, before we start our analysis on consumption, so it's going to be kind of mathematical, all the things we look at. So the starting point when you study consumption is utility function, and we assume that utility is a function of consumption. Now, most of you should know already that a standard utility function has two characteristics. That is that its first derivative is positive, and its second derivative is negative. So we have increasing utility in consumption. The more you consume, the more utility you get. But that happens at a decreasing level. So utility is concave, and marginal utility is positive but falling. So what is the interpretation of concavity of a utility function? The interpretation is that the person we are looking at, the consumer, is risk averse. So a concave utility function, if you have consumption here and utility as a function of consumption at the other axis, what does concavity mean? It means that consumption or the utility function looks something like this. What does it mean? Concave utility means that our consumer is risk averse. How can you see that? Well, you have to look at the choice that somebody can be given between a gamble and an amount for sure. Suppose there are two outcomes consumption is low. Another outcome is that with 50% probability, consumption is high. So you have a gamble, and with 1/2 probability, your consumption will be low, but you also have a 50% chance that the consumption will be high. Now, what is the expected amount of the gamble? What is the expected amount you can gain? Is CL plus CH divided by 2. Now, you can get this amount, CL plus CH divided by 2, for sure. What will your utility be? Well, you can read the utility of this amount here. So here you will find the utility of CL plus CH divided by 2. That's when you get this amount for sure, that's your utility. Now, what is the utility of the gamble? But in case you have a gamble, you don't know for sure what your utility will be, because you can have, with 50% probability, a negative outcome, in which case you will have a low consumption, or you can have, with 50% probability, a high outcome. So, in that case, we talk about expected utility, because we don't know for sure where we will end up. And how can you calculate expected utility of this gamble? Well, you just draw a line here between those 2 points. Basically, end up here. This point basically tells you the utility with 50% probability, utility of L plus 50% probability, utility will be CH. This we call expected utility. That's the expected utility of the gamble. And this is the utility when you get the amount for sure. This is, if you want, utility of the expected consumption. If you get CL plus CH divided by 2 for sure, you have utility of the expected value of consumption. If you take a gamble, your utility is expected utility, and it's given by 50% times so the probability that you end up in the low consumption state, plus the probability that you end up in the high consumption state. Now, how can we see that the consumer with this utility function is risk averse? Because if a consumer is risk averse, he or she prefers the amount for sure. So the utility of the sure amount is higher than the expected utility of the gamble. And the difference here in the figure is this. Concave utility means that our consumer prefers the amount for sure over the gamble. If our person were risk lover, so that's also possible, someone who prefers risk, who's not averse, utility would be convex. So the concavity of the utility function determines your risk aversion, and the more risk averse you are, the more concave your utility will be. You also have the possibility that a person is neither risk averse nor risk loving, that the person is risk neutral. In that case, what would your utility function look like? It would be a straight line. Because in that case, the utility of a certain amount would be equal to the expected utility of the gamble. That's risk neutrality. But for all practical purposes, first derivative of the utility function, this is always going to be positive. The second derivative is always going to be negative. We are going to look next week at the third derivative, which can just get something else. We'll not talk about this today in detail. And so, importantly, the second derivative is important because it captures the attitude a consumer has toward risk. If the second derivative is negative, as we will always assume, we have a risk-averse consumer. If, on the other hand, a person is risk-neutral, we would have utility as a straight line. And if the person were risk-lover or risk-affine, we would have a positive second derivative. We would have a convex utility. In those cases, we will not look. Now, of course, you already see now that risk attitude can be measured through the second derivative of the utility function. So, when you have a measure of risk aversion, and one of those is what we call L1P1 measure of risk aversion, you will measure risk aversion or this coefficient through the second derivative. Now the second derivative is negative, so we put a minus sign there to make it positive. And why do we divide by the first derivative? That's because utility can be multiplied by some constant. You can add some constant to utility, you can multiply utility by some constant. It will not affect behavior. That's because utility is basically an ordinal ranking. Now, of course, if you have a utility function and you multiply it by k, the behavior of your consumer is exactly the same thing. But of course, the second derivative will also be multiplied by k. That means that risk aversion, if it were only measured through the second derivative and you multiply it by k, you would get a much higher risk aversion coefficient. That's not what you want. So to standardize your risk aversion coefficient, you typically divide by the first derivative. Why is that? Because multiplying utility by some constant or adding some constant to utility does not affect behavior, but it does affect the risk aversion coefficient. So you standardize risk aversion coefficient by dividing by the first derivative. And then you make the distinction. You have two types of risk aversion. You have what we call absolute risk aversion. And this is just this division. It's minus the second derivative divided by the first derivative. So the more concave your utility, the more risk averse, and the higher your absolute risk aversion will be. Then you also have what we call relative risk aversion. Then you multiply absolute risk aversion by C to get relative risk aversion. Those are the two coefficients that we will look at, but mainly we are interested in the L1P1 coefficient of relative risk aversion. So let's take a look at a number of specific utility functions. So those are utility functions that we will look at frequently. Sometimes we will look at the first one, which is quadratic utility. And sometimes, even more often, we will look at the CRRA utility function, which is the third one. There's also the constant absolute, so first is quadratic utility, second is constant absolute risk aversion utility. We will, maybe you will see that in the last lecture when you discuss some practical things, but we will not meet it any further. But the third one is important, that's the constant relative risk aversion utility function. So the first and the third are the ones that matter for